The Linux kernel is a Unix-like computer operating system kernel. It is used worldwide. The Linux operating system is based on it and deployed on both traditional computer systems such as personal computers and servers, usually in the form of Linux distributions, and on various embedded devices such as routers and NAS appliances. The Android operating system for tablet computers, smartphones and smartwatches is also based atop the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel was conceived and created in 1991 by Finnish computer science student Linus Torvalds for his personal computer and with no cross-platform intentions, but has since expanded to support a huge array of computer architectures, many more than other operating systems or kernels. Linux rapidly attracted developers and users who adapted code from other free software projects for use with the new operating system. The Linux kernel has received contributions from nearly 12,000 programmers from more than 1,200 companies, including some of the largest software and hardware vendors. The Linux Kernel API, the application programming interface through which user programs interact with the kernel, is meant to be very stable and to not break user space programs. As part of the kernel's functionality, device drivers control the hardware. Mainlined device drivers are also meant to be very stable. However, the interface between the kernel and loadable kernel modules, unlike in many other kernels and operating systems, is not meant to be very stable by design. The Linux kernel, developed by contributors worldwide, is a prominent example of free and open-source software. Day-to-day development discussions take place on the Linux kernel mailing list. The Linux kernel is released under the new General Public License version 2, with some firmware images released under various non-free licenses. History. In April 1991, Linus Torvalds, a 21-year-old student at the University of Helsinki, Finland, started working on some simple ideas for an operating system. He started with a task switcher in Intel 80386 assembly language and a terminal driver. On the 25th of August 1991, Torvalds posted the following to Compos Minix, a news group on Usenet. "I'm doing a operating system for 386 clones. This has been brewing since April, and is starting to get ready. I'd like any feedback on things people like, dislike in Minix, as my OS resembles it somewhat among other things. I've currently ported Bash and GCC, and things seem to work. This implies that I'll get something practical within a few months. Yes, it's free of any Minix code, and it has a multi-threaded fasteners. It is not portable, and it probably never will support anything other than at hard disks, as that's all I have, and segmentation. It's the segmentation that makes it really 386 dependent. Some of my C files are almost as much assembler as a C. Unlike Minix, I also happen to like interrupts, so interrupts are handled without trying to hide the reason behind them." After that, many people contributed code to the project. Early on, the Minix community contributed code and ideas to the Linux kernel. At the time, the new project had created many of the components required for a free operating system, but its own kernel, GNU-herd, was incomplete and unavailable. The BSD operating system had not yet freed itself from legal encumbrances. Despite the limited functionality of the early versions, Linux rapidly accumulated developers and users. By September 1991, version 0.01 of the Linux kernel was released on the FTP server of the Finnish University and Research Network. It had 10,239 lines of code. In October 1991, version 0.02 of the Linux kernel was released. In December 1991, Linux kernel 0.11 was released. This version was the first to be self-hosted, as Linux kernel 0.11 could be compiled by a computer running the same kernel version. When Torvalds released version 0.12 in February 1992, he adopted the new general public license over his previous self-drafted license, which had not permitted commercial redistribution. A newsgroup known as alt.os.linux was started, and on the 19th of January 1992, the first post to alt.os.linux was made. On the 31st of March 1992, alt.os.linux became comp.os.linux. The X Window system was soon ported to Linux. In March 1992, Linux version 0.95 was the first to be capable of running X. This large version number jump was due to a feeling that a version 1.0 with no major, missing pieces was imminent. However, this proved to be somewhat over-optimistic, and from 1993 to early 1994, 15 development versions of version 0.99 appeared. On the 14th of March 1994, Linux Kernel 1.0.0 was released, with 176,250 lines of code. In March 1995, Linux Kernel 1.2.0 was released, with 310,950 lines of code. Version 2 of the Linux kernel, released on the 9th of June 1996, was followed by additional major versions under the version 2 header. The 25th of January 1999 release of Linux Kernel 2.2.0. The 18th of December 1999 IBM mainframe patches for 2.2.13 were published, allowing Linux kernel to be used on enterprise-class machines. The 4th of January 2001 release of Linux Kernel 2.4.0. The 17th of December 2003 release of Linux Kernel 2.6.0. Starting in 2004, the release process changed and new kernels started coming out on a regular schedule every 2 to 3 months, numbered 2.6.0, 2.6.1, up through 2.6.39. On the 21st of July 2011, Torvalds announced the release of Linux Kernel 3.0. Gone are the 2.6, less than big num greater than days. The version bump is not about major technological changes when compared to Linux 2.6.39. It marks the kernel's 20th anniversary. The time-based release process remained the same. Version 3.10 of the Linux kernel, released in June 2013, contains 15,803,499 lines of code, while the version 4.1, released in June 2015, has grown to over 19.5 million lines of code contributed by almost 14,000 programmers. Tannenbaum Torvalds debate the fact that Linux is a monolithic kernel rather than a microkernel was the topic of a debate between Andrew S. Tannenbaum, the creator of Minix, and Linus Torvalds. The debate started in 1992 on the Usenet discussion group Comp.os. Minix was about Linux and kernel architecture in general. Tannenbaum argued that microkernels are superior to monolithic kernels and that therefore Linux is obsolete. Unlike traditional monolithic kernels, device drivers in Linux are easily configured as loadable kernel modules and are loaded or unloaded while running the system. This subject was revisited on the 9th of May 2006, and on the 12th of May 2006 Tannenbaum wrote a position statement. Popularity. The huge rise in popularity of the Android operating system, which includes the Linux kernel, has made the kernel the most popular choice for mobile devices, rivaling the installed base of all other operating systems. Including previous years, 3 billion Android smartphones were estimated to have been sold by the end of 2014. Some consumer routers also use the Linux kernel, which is also the case for a wide variety of other devices, such as servers, smart TVs, and other non-Android embedded systems. However, the kernel's use in traditional desktop Linux varieties is still low in comparison to other operating systems. Legal aspects. Licensing terms. Initially, Torvalds released Linux under a license which forbade any commercial use. This was changed in version 0.12 to the new General Public License. This license allows distribution and sale of possibly modified and unmodified versions of Linux, but requires that all those copies be released under the same license and be accompanied by the complete corresponding source code. Torvalds has described licensing Linux under the GPL as the best thing I ever did. GPL version 3. The Linux kernel is licensed explicitly only under version 2 of the GPL, without offering the licensee the option to choose any later version, which is a common GPL extension. There was a debate over how easily it could be changed to use later GPL versions such as version 3 and whether this is even desirable. Torvalds himself specifically indicated upon the release of version 2.4.0 that his own code is only under version 2. However, the terms of the GPL state that if no version is specified, then any version may be used. And Alan Cox pointed out that very few other Linux contributors have specified a particular version of the GPL. In September 2006, a survey of 29 key kernel programmers indicated that 28 preferred GPL v2 to the then current GPL v3 draft. Torvalds commented, "I think a number of outsiders believed that I personally was just the odd man out, because I've been so publicly not a huge fan of the GPL v3. This group of high-profile kernel developers, including Linus Torvalds, Greg Crower, Hartman and Andrew Morton, commented on mass media about their objections to the GPL v3. They refer to clauses regarding DRM, TiVoization, patents, additional restrictions, and warned of balkanization of the open-source universe by the GPL v3. Linus Torvalds, who decided not to adopt the GPL v3 for the Linux kernel, reiterated his criticism even years later. Loadable kernel modules. It is debated whether loadable kernel modules are to be considered derivative works under copyright law, and thereby fall under the terms of the GPL. Torvalds has stated his belief that LKMs using only a limited, public subset of the kernel interfaces can sometimes be non-derived works, thus allowing some binary-only drivers and other LKMs that are not licensed under the GPL. A very good example for this is the usage of DMA_BUF by the proprietary NVIDIA graphics drivers. DMA_BUF is a recent kernel feature that allows multiple GPUs to quickly copy data into each other's frame buffers. One possible use case would be NVIDIA Optimus that pairs a fast GPU with an Intel integrated GPU, where the NVIDIA GPU writes into the Intel frame buffer when it is active. But NVIDIA cannot use this infrastructure because it uses a technical means to enforce the rule that it can only be used by LKMs that are also GPL. Alan Cox replied on LKML, rejecting a request from one of their engineers to remove this technical enforcement from the API. Not all Linux kernel contributors agree with this interpretation, however, and even Torvalds agrees that many LKMs are clearly derived works. And indeed he writes that kernel modules are derivative by default. On the other hand, Torvalds has also said that one gray area in particular is something like a driver that was originally written for another operating system. That is a gray area, and that is the area where I personally believe that some modules may be considered to not be derived works simply because they weren't designed for Linux and don't depend on any special Linux behavior. Proprietary graphics drivers, in particular, are heavily discussed. Ultimately, it is likely that such questions can only be resolved by a court. Kernel modules, network, netlink, network scheduler, netfilter and NF tables. Comparison of open-source wireless drivers, graphics and general-purpose computing on graphics processing units. Direct rendering manager, graphics execution manager, free and open-source device drivers, graphics Sound Advanced Linux Sound Architecture. Free and open source device drivers. Audio. Input HevDev. Firmware binary blobs. One point of licensing controversy is the use of firmware binary blobs in Linux kernel to support several hardware devices. These files are under a variety of licenses, out of which many are restrictive and their exact underlying source code is usually unknown. In 2002, Richard Stallman stated why, in his point of view, such blobs make the Linux kernel partially non-free software, and that distributing Linux kernel violates the GPL, which requires complete corresponding source code to be available. In 2008, Free Software Foundation Latin America started Linux Libre as a project that creates a completely free variant of the Linux kernel without proprietary objects. It is used by certain completely free Linux distributions, such as those endorsed by the Free Software Foundation, while it can also be used on most distributions. On 15 December 2010, the Debian project announced that the next Debian stable version would come with a kernel stripped of all non-free firmware bits. This policy was continued to be applied in later stable Debian releases. Trademark Linux is a registered trademark of Linus Torvalds in the United States and some other countries. This is the result of an incident in which William Delacroce, Jr., who was not involved in the Linux project, trademarked the name and subsequently demanded royalties for its use. Several Linux backers retained legal counsel and filed suit against Delacroce. The issue was settled in August 1997 when the trademark was assigned to Linus Torvalds. SCO litigation. In March 2003, the SCO group filed a lawsuit against IBM claiming that IBM had violated copyrights that SCO claimed to hold over the Unix source code, by contributing portions of that code to Linux. Additionally, SCO sent letters to a number of companies warning that their use of Linux without a license from SCO may be a violation of copyright law, and claimed in the press that they would be suing individual Linux users. IBM then promised to defend its Linux customers on their behalf. This controversy has generated lawsuits by SCO against Novell, Daimler Chrysler, and AutoZone, and retaliatory lawsuits by Red Hat and others against SCO. In early 2007, SCO filed the specific details of the purported copyright infringement. Despite previous claims that SCO was the rightful owner of 1 million lines of code, they specified 326 lines of code, most of which were uncopyrightable. In August 2007, the court in the Novell case ruled that SCO did not actually own the Unix copyrights to begin with, though the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in August 2009 that the question of who owned the copyright properly remained for a jury to answer. The jury case was decided on 30 March 2010 in Novell's favor.